Well, my next game is a bit more sophisticated than the first example. It's an all-grandmaster clash from the Bishkek zonal tournament of 1993 between Leonid Yurtayev and Grigory Serper. But again, it's designed to get you used to the idea that decisions made in the opening and maybe in the middle game affect the end game in a profound way. Anyway, Leonid Yurtayev seems very confident in his opening play with white. Black plays the Nimzo Indian defence. Bishop comes out to b4, pinning the knight on c3, and Black introduces the notion that he might well take this knight at some point, doubling the pawns. Same type of idea as the Ruy-Lopez exchange variation. Black is trying to downgrade white's pawns at the earliest possible opportunity. And Yurtayev actually encourages him here with the move a3. This is the same-ish variation, and it's one of the absolutely most sharp ways to tackle the Nimzo Indian. Obviously, Black should go on with his threat. And now he plays c5. And, you know, taking a look at this position, you might ask yourself, why on earth should white ever play this variation? Well, the fact is that actually white's plans are very aggressive. White has two bishops, and he's potentially got what we call a mobile pawn centre. What white hopes to do in the early middle game is to push these central pawns up the board to disrupt Black's game, and in the end, maybe even to start a kingside attack. So the plan of development that white has in mind is something like bishop to d3, knight comes out to e2, maybe he castles, maybe he doesn't, but he certainly wants to play e4 and then f4, maybe f5, get the kingside pawn storm going. Yes, Black has what we call a static advantage, because white's got those double pawns on the queen side. But it takes time for Black to train his sights on those double pawns, and meanwhile white's starting this procedure of the kingside attack going. Consequently, many attacking players like to play the white side, but it can go wrong. If you mistime your attack, or Black simply plays very, very well, you can end up with permanent weaknesses on the queen side. That's the risk you're taking. There's no plan B with this variation, and that's why a lot of grandmasters, particularly high-level players, don't necessarily like it. They don't like variations where there's no plan B. They like to have some sort of flexibility, some options at their disposal. So play goes on much as expected. Black develops his pieces. White brings the bishop out to d3. Black speeds ahead with development. The knight comes to e2. And now pawn to b6. That's a good move. Not perhaps with the idea of bishop b7, but maybe with the idea of bishop a6. An active deployment looking to put pressure on the pawn at c4. They're still playing theory. White plays e4, and now what we call a prophylactic move. Black moves his knight out of the way of white's advancing pawns, and maybe prepares to stop white's f-pawn dead in its tracks, something like this, with a move like f5. Black is blocking the white pawn centre from coming forward. In fact, I've had this position in my own games. I used to play this variation with white. I even played it against Nigel Short, and it was an interesting game which ended in a draw. This position, I've grown to dislike it for white. It might be playable, but Black's position is very, very sturdy. And Black does have a plan B in this position. Once he blockades the central pawns, he can go on to think about attacking this pawn on c4, which is very, very weak. So in this game, after knight e8, Yurtayev plays a very interesting move here, pawn up to h4. Now that looks just like a sort of futile attacking gesture, but it's not. There are various ways white can use this pawn on h4 to good effect, and certainly bishop g5 is a move at several points which Black must consider with respect. So h4 is an interesting move. Serper gets on with his plan, and now white plays e5. Very consequent idea. And the point of this move is that if Black now plays knight a5, now white utilises this idea of bishop g5. That's more or less the point of h4. And if f6, we have queen c2. Another very nice point. And white is getting a vicious attack in this position. That, in a sense, justifies the move h4, before Black even gets a chance to take the pawn on c2. White is hitting hard on the king side, and we don't have to look too far after f takes g5 bishop takes h7 check to see that white is getting what looks like a winning attack here. Obviously, if king h8, we go h takes g5, threatening vicious discovered checks, and if king f7, then clearly black has to reckon with the consequences of white's queen coming in. So that's how quickly the black position can fall apart in this variation. Serper, to his credit, plays logically in the centre with d6. The usual reaction to a guy who plays on the edge of the board is to react in the centre. So that's what black does. Queen c2 was played. Black defended his pawn. White moved in with bishop h7 check, hoping to drive the king to a slightly worse square on h8, and now he goes bishop e4. And the point of driving that king to h8 is to introduce again the move bishop g5 into the equation. If black took the bishop, white will recapture and it will be discovered check. So it's quite a useful little Zwischenzug there, bishop h7 check. Okay, the knight's attacked. Black defends it. Queen a4, double attack on the knight and the bishop, easily parried with knight a5. And you see, this is the problem with the position for white, because his initial attack has been repelled, and the question is, what is left? Provoking rook c8 there by black was not necessarily a good idea, because it makes this pawn on c4 even weaker. Black's already threatening to win that pawn. He's threatening to take it off with the bishop, and black can easily introduce the rook into the game with c takes d4. So this was the type of position which really actually put me off this variation. If black plays carefully and manages to repel the initial white attack, what is left? Well, the spectre of a bad endgame is left, and that's exactly what white gets in this game. Now clearly, with all the pieces on, white can still keep it complicated, and he moves his bishop back to b1 with the idea maybe of playing queen c2, setting up mating ideas. Black continues to react in a very positive way in the centre of the board. He chops on e5, and then he chops on c4. And he bravely answers queen c2 with the block f5, so that when white takes, he takes back with the knight, and now he's defending against the threat of mate. White plays his idea, bishop to g5. Black is on top of the tactics and plays bishop to b3, forcing the exchange of queens, I think, unless white wants to inherit a truly miserable position. White's problem is that black's queen, it connects with the bishop down to the d1 square, and if queen g6, well, there we go, checkmate. So, going back to the game, there is an exchange of pieces. Bishop takes f6 was played. Bishop takes c2. Of course, this is not what white wants to see, as endgames are now becoming very bad for him. White tries bishop takes b6, a takes b6, rook takes b1, knight c4. And there have been a lot of exchanges. Now, the problem with this position, white is worse in this endgame. And the way we can assess this is to consider the pawn structure. 3 pawn islands each, but this pawn is very difficult to defend. That is the major idea in this position, and black just easily can come across and take it. Black's weakest pawn is the pawn at e6, but as you can see, white is a long way off being able to attack that pawn. So the upshot of this opening variation is that white is about to lose a pawn, and really he has no compensation for it. If he goes rook takes b6 in this position, we have knight c2, and if king d1, we have rook takes f2. Tactics favour the player who is better developed. King takes, rook takes, I don't know, maybe white should try this, but it's a thoroughly miserable rook and pawn endgame, double rook and pawn endgame, where only black can win, and there's going to be much suffering in this position. That's definitely not the type of thing you want to go in for against a grandmaster, because you've got no chance to win the game whatsoever, and you're just going to be suffering for ages. But you know, maybe white should have done that, I don't know. It's difficult to offer good advice. He played rook b2, black played e5, white played rook e4, and now black worked with tactics to play b5. And the point of that is that after rook takes e5, we have knight c4, forking the two rooks. All of white's problems are stemming from his choice of opening variation. Black plays knight c4. Again, this is a tactic. There's another fork. So after knight c4, white had to play his rook to a passive square, rook c2, king g8, a very useful move, bringing the king closer to the centre for the endgame. White does the same, and now black activates his rook. White goes knight g3, black plays rook f4. White plays rook e2, and black plays rook f6. Basically, black has an advantage here. There's no rush. White plays a paradoxical move. A pawn down, he offers an exchange of pieces. But he's so worried by the active rook on a1 that he decides it's better off the board. Moreover, his own rook has become much more active now than it ever was, and black's rook is passive on c6. b4, very good, creating a passed pawn. That's exactly what black wants. But he has to negotiate the next passage of play as white starts to give a series of checks. And it looks as though actually white is bailing out here, because after the check on a7, black has got to play a move here which allows the g7 pawn to be taken if he doesn't want to draw. Serper carries on, king to d8. Rook comes to b7. Well, clearly there was an idea that if rook takes g7 here, black would play a move like b3, and that pawn would be exceptionally difficult to stop, as you can see. So, going back to the game, white gets his rook in behind the passed pawn. Black plays rook b6, and the game tumbles into a knight endgame, which I think white was probably hoping to draw. Now he's a pawn down. There are some prospects of drawing this, but it's not simple, because despite the fact that the white king can stop the c-pawn, there are still some problems on the king side, and in fact, black's already threatening knight f4. The knight f4 idea shows itself in the variation where white comes across and gobbles on g7. Then black plays knight f4, king d1, king f6, knight e8 check, and then king g5, with a very superior endgame, as black is going to remain a pawn up. He may even go 2 pawns up in the ensuing play, and the knight endgame should be easily winning. So in the game, white decides to keep the knight out of f4, understandable. Black brings his king up, and then his knight back, attacking the pawn. The first point of this is that if g4 in this position, king comes to d6, knight b7, king d5, king takes c3, and now the puncturing move, e4. An excellent idea. F takes, king takes, and both of the white pieces find themselves offside. So going back to the position in the game, king takes c3 was played, knight takes h5, g4, knight f6, and now white played king to c4. g6, black's aiming to create an outside passed pawn there with h5. White brings his knight back, and now again black plays this puncturing move, e4, creating a pair of passed pawns on the king side by force, and reaching what should be a technical winning endgame. And the Grandmaster mops up with good technique. Well, white's only source of counterplay here is to try to push his pawn. Black doesn't play king e6, that's a passive square. Instead, he puts his king on f5. King d5, and here's the advance that white cannot stop, g5. It's very convenient for black that he can stop the pawn here with knight f6, and then g4 forces the white knight back to a passive square. Black pushes his king side pawns and keeps pushing. Knights are very bad holding up outside passed pawns, whereas, as you can see, black's knight holds the central passed pawn with ease. e7 was answered by king e4, and now white played the miserable move, knight h4. It's worthwhile noting that king e6 here is answered by the beautiful move, knight d5. If black queens, knight c7 check wins immediately, And if e8 equals knight, then we have knight f4 check, uprooting the blockader, and white can't get his knight back. That's a nice variation. So just going back to the position in the game, after knight h4, knight e8 check was played, king g7, black stations the knight out of reach of the white king, king d6, nothing else, king f4, king d5, and black closes the net, getting ready for the advance of his pawns. King goes to e4, g2, and in fact in the game, in this position, white resigned. There really is no way to stop those pawns. For instance, if he goes knight takes g2, well, king takes g2, and the pawn is queening, the h pawn. If he goes knight f3, then we go h4. I think this move wins fairly easily, and if black tries a trick, we can queen, check, king, takes, king e5, h3, king f6, knight e8, check, king f7, and again we play this move holding the white king arm's length, knight c7. So I think that must have been a long and grueling struggle, which at the end of it, you know, only the winner enjoys. For the loser, that is a most miserable experience. But I would argue that the scene was set for that experience as early as move 4, when white played a3, inviting this position. He went into an opening variation where there was no plan B. Now, this is a question of style. You either like this sort of thing, or you don't. Yurtayev obviously was happy to do this, but look what suffering he had to endure. So please do play these sharp opening variations, but also please have some idea of where they're going and what the consequences might be in the endgame.